The chandeliers at the Turnbull Hall threw shards of light like 1,000 small accusations. Cameras flashed, dresses rustled, champagne whispered against crystal. Ethel Collier stood beneath the glow, with her back straight, jaw set, watching a crowd that had decided she was guilty before any verdict was ever spoken. A phone screen flashed in a reporter's hand. The headline crawled across like a verdict. Mystery scandal. Mrs. Tyler seen with a stranger. The clip, 30 seconds of grainy footage from a hotel camera, carried a dozen different interpretations. There was laughter, a blurred embrace, then two figures slipping behind the curtains whisper. Someone in a silk dress had thrown a shoe over a shoulder. The clip didn't show what happened later. It never did. That was the point. Inference was cheaper than truth. "Ethel," whispered a voice behind her. Her sister, Blythe, or Blee, depending on which cousin had decided to change the spelling for the society pages this month. The word came out small and sharp, a splinter of sympathy dressed in resentment. Ethel did not turn. She could feel the heat of 100 unread judgments settle on her shoulders. Her husband's name, Ramley Tyler, was already being scooped into the sentence. His family murmured at the back, eyebrows groomed into lines of condemnation. Everywhere there were faces that belonged to people whose livelihoods depended on a simple social alignment: the beautiful, the respectable, the unassailable. Tonight, Ethel was a variable threatening their symmetry. She had been careful. She had been careful enough to call a car, careful enough to sign her marriage certificate for a reason that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with shelter. Ramley's name had offered a ledger line of convenience to a poet's daughter. But the ledger could be balanced by scandal, and our world was excellent at finding new columns. The clip was an act of arithmetic, a few frames multiplied by 1,000 unkind imaginations, and the sum was ruin. He arrived like a rumor with a coat. Fielding Turnbull moved through the room without touching anyone, as if the contact itself might tarnish him. He had the posture of people born into rooms like this, graceful, edged, not needing to announce presence because presence was already part of the wallpaper. He paused when he saw her. For 3 breaths, the room contracted around them. The press eased forward, cords of cameras whispering like steel vines. Someone clipped a mic closer, as if listening for electricity. Ethel's first instinct was to look away. She had survived 1,000 small cruelties by making herself less visible. That was how she learned to carry dignity when it meant being invisible. But Fielding's eyes found her and held her the way a hand might locate a lost object, briefly, impartially, and with an attention that felt dangerous only because it had never been given to her by anyone of consequence. Recognition flickered in him, then shut. He gave the room a look that was both amusement and dismissal. A turn of his mouth said he found the spectacle distasteful. His eyes, for a fraction, softened in a way a camera could not read. He did not speak her name aloud. Instead, he drifted toward the dais, but the image of him tightened the air around Ethel. There were murmurs, "Who was the man?" and the sentence pattern shifted. People preferred stories with tidy arcs. Unknown man equals unknown motive. Unknown man with a Turnbull name attached created a calculus nobody had time for. Fielding was always newsworthy in the kind of economies that fed elite soap. That a Turnbull might have shared a room across a curtain with Mrs. Tyler made every strategist in the room recalculate. "You should leave," Blythe said again, and this time Ethel let herself turn. Her face, framed by a dress that yesterday might have been a display of careless elegance, was calm like a knife blade. The Collier, Ethel's father, Poet Collier, was elsewhere, already explaining to a cluster of distant relatives that the clip was fabricated, a trick of editing and half-truths, that her daughter was misunderstood. It was the language of defense that sounded less than the accusation.
Ethel had little appetite for defense that sounded rehearsed. Ramley stood a few yards away, looking smaller every second. He had the habit of appearing at social events like an accessory, polished, obliging, and never inconveniently present. His hand hovered near hers for a moment and then moved away. His nervous smile was a commodity he did not know how to spend. The Tyler cousins at his side wore the expression of men who had been taught to look only at advantage. They did not reach for him, and he did not reach for her. Fielding watched that exchange with a scientist's interest, a slight exhalation, a tilt of the head. He could be cruel with distance. He could be disarmingly appalled, as if anything beneath his notice was beneath his contempt. He could also, in private spaces, cross lines in ways that made people mistake his moments of action for affection. That complexity was one reason people made conspiracy theories out of his life. "Mr. Turnbull," said a woman in pearls, Madam Turnbull, with a voice that polished commands into society. She arrived beside him with the same perfect timing that had kept the Turnbull name above scandal for generations. Somewhere behind her, Lilac Benson's eyes glinted. Lilac, who had been spoken of as a match for Fielding, a practical union between two families that had everything to gain and nothing to risk. Lilac's gaze on Ethel was an assessment. Fielding nodded, deferential in the way the Turnbulls nodded to each other, and then the public show resumed its momentum. Another toast, another speech. Conversation flowed in precise currents, and the cameras drank it like they had been starved. Ethel left before anyone asked her to.
She walked to the back corridors where servants kept the echoes of the hall. She could feel the warmth of her coat like a small private protest against the world's chill. The hotel where the clip had been recorded was 2 blocks away, a hotel with cameras at every entrance because the cameras made its reputation as much as its carpets. Ethel had been there the night footage claimed she'd been seen. She had, in fact, been there after midnight because she had gone to meet a young woman who needed help with a paper. She had crossed paths with a stranger who had seemed in distress. He had been pale, falling into the taxi ranks with cigarette smoke in his lungs. She had given him the last of her umbrella and an iced coffee, and then forgotten the evening, thinking herself too ordinary for consequence. She had thought, too, that what had happened between strangers could remain small. She could not have imagined that a single warm gesture would be parsed into a moral ledger. By morning, the clip had traveled further than any of them could walk. It was not only the papers. Social media took the frames and compiled them, added captions, suggested motives. People who had never heard her name now had opinions about her character. There were whispers about impropriety, innuendo from anonymous sources, the tiresome moralizing of a public that believed it performed righteousness by shaming. At home, her phone buzzed with messages she shelved for a later pain. Poet Collier paced in the kitchen, his creativity folded into a series of distressed calls. Blythe left and returned like a tide. Vanessa, whose relation to Ethel had always been fluid in family scrapbooks, rang to suggest an advantageous statement. "You need to remove yourself from the social scene, darling. It's the only way. Quiet exit." The language was practical and cruel. Ethel took the calls with the politeness of someone who had rehearsed how to reply to applause. The world had become a chorus with a single pitch: get rid of the problem. For those with power, problems were expected to be disposed of quickly and cleanly. For Ethel, who had always been something of a query mark in a ledger, disposal felt like erasure. The Tyler family moved with the efficiency of accountants. A meeting was convened at noon. The terms were practical, cold. "A cooling-off period," Ramley proposed, his voice sounding more like someone reading from an instruction manual than a man engaging with his wife. "Publicly stepping away until this dies down. We can go abroad. It will be better for both of us." Ethel looked at him without bitterness, only a tired clarity. The marriage had always been a document more than a devotion. She did not want escape, she wanted truth. But truth cost less in social terms if you were the one to owe it. "I won't be hidden." The words landed like a small bomb. "If you want me to step out of view, you'll have to explain why you think I'm the problem." No one had prepared a satisfactory retort to that. Ramley, who had never been trained in dignity or defiance, blinked and then retreated to the safety of silence. The first formal threat came in the shape of a politely worded letter from the Tyler lawyers recommending separation proceedings to preserve the family name. It was composed in legal cadences that made everything sound like an inevitability. Ethel read it on a park bench, the sun indifferent and bright, and felt something inside her harden. It was not just about a clip, it was about a world that presumed to own her silence. Fielding watched all of this with a pace that startled her. He moved at the intersection where public indifference met private intent. When he appeared at the hospital later that week, no one in the waiting room had expected him, least of all Ethel. She had been driving home when a car cut across her lane, an impatient vehicle whose driver mistook the turning lane for a dare. The collision was minor in physics, but major in consequence. Her car spun onto the curb, the airbag scented with dust and perfume. The accident was a punctuation mark in a week full of commas. Someone screamed, someone else called the ambulance. The cameras converged because accidents were another kind of spectacle. They put her in a room, a quiet place where the fluorescent lights turned everything clinical and white. A nurse took her vitals, an orderly helped with a cup of water that might as well have been ambrosia. She was watched by hospital staff and the intermittent presence of reporters who congregated in the emergency room foyer as if trauma were a fashion trend. She had come to the hospital expecting to be alone with herself for a night, to let noise settle into the small limestone of reality. It did not happen. The door opened, and Fielding stood there, coat unbuttoned, expression like a locked safe that had been opened to check for a specific thing and found it intact. "You all right?" he asked, as if an unemotional question could measure bruises. She shrugged and, for a second too long, allowed herself to examine him. He looked less a man that moment and more an idea, precise, cultivated, almost implausible. People who knew him publicly had long ago decided he might be incapable of tenderness. People who had seen him once or twice in private said things in whispers about him that ranged from cold to ruinously kind, depending on their appetite for romantic danger. "You were in the news," she said finally, because it was true, because it felt like a way to anchor the moment to an immediate fact instead of drifting into indentured sentiment. He glanced at his phone, then back at her. News is a tide. It doesn't have the courtesy of a calendar. "Do you know me?" Her voice wasn't a question that required an answer, but she wanted to know what he saw when he looked at her now.
He considered her like someone appraising a problem he might fix or a project he might take on. He could not meet her gaze perfectly. "I know the version that appears in bad lighting. I remember a version that didn't have a camera in it," he said. She thought of the night that had happened months ago, a charity event, the river that cut through the city quarters like an old seam, a man on the edge of something he couldn't articulate. She had offered him coffee, a cigarette stub, her last umbrella out of pity and no small curiosity. He had been sharp when awake, apologetic when drunk. He had left before dawn and with only a brief, dislodged kiss that meant nothing at all in the ledger of her life. She had not thought of him again in any way that mattered. That he remembered her mattered. He sat down on a plastic chair beside the bed with the ease of someone accustomed to being the center of orchestrated rooms. "You didn't deserve that," he said, blunt and entirely unsentimental, "and they shouldn't have dragged you through. It was never their job, Ethel interrupted. She had the tiredness of someone who had rehearsed this defense before. But you'll forgive me for not being grateful for anyone who moves me like a chess piece. He gave a brief, dry laugh that smelled faintly of cigarettes and something cultivated. No. When he stood, he did so with the unassuming air of someone who had decided. He told the head nurse that he would deal with the press. He told an overeager reporter that there had been spoken to hospital administration and there will be no interviews at this time. He used a name that opened a door without permission. Turnbull Foundation. He had resources. He had staff. He had, in a room full of brittle consciences, enough weight to move the world a little. The press coughed and dispersed, hungry for a better story. The hospital staff treated his words like orders not to be questioned. He did not ask for anything in return. He disappeared as quickly as he had arrived, like someone sending a message by the economy of his actions rather than his words. Ethel sat in the dim hospital light and felt a strange, private gratitude and equal anger. What right did he have to make decisions about her life? What right did anyone think they had? The rescue felt like an intrusion and a lifeline at the same time. That was an uncomfortable place to be. By evening, the lawyer letters accelerated. The Tyler Council insisted on a public statement of separation. Madame Turnbull issued an equally crisp bulletin, framed with concern. The Turnbulls will not be associated with scandal. Lilac sent a note of cool regret. The social ledger clicked at a machine pace. Fielding continued to be a rumor at the edges of Ethel's days. He sent a terse message, clinical, impersonal, offering legal assistance through a firm his name could open. She refused, politely.
To accept help from a man who could give anything would be to place herself in a new kind of dependency. "I am not a charity," she texted. Her fingers trembled more than her voice, but she felt fierce about that line. Dignity could be a posture as much as a policy. He replied with a single sentence. "I am not offering charity. I am offering consequence." The phrasing was precise and unnerving. What kind of consequence did a man like Fielding Turnbull offer? He moved in legal currents and quiet interventions, in a network of media handlers and private investigators. Consequence could mean he would produce exculpatory footage, or produce witnesses, or subpoena the original files that the hotel claimed were the only copies. It could also mean he would make a very public demonstration of his displeasure that would, in its social daring, realign loyalties. Ethel found herself compelled and repelled by the idea that someone would choose to carry her name into a fight he had not been invited to join. She had not asked for a champion. She had never wanted to be a prize to be publicly claimed. Yet the idea that someone with his leverage might actually use his force to strip rumors of their teeth was intoxicating in a small way. It was a promise that rumor might be made to look foolish. All the same, she put her phone to sleep and walked into her small apartment that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. There were poems folded in drawers, small stacks of bills, a kettle that sang reluctantly. She was not careless with life. She was careful in ways that had become survival, and her pride was a thing she folded into the hems of everyday tasks so she would not break. Her father came over that night and sat on the threadbare couch with the look of a man who thought his best defense was eloquence. He recited a press release that had been written with his voice, but not his conviction. "Do not let this small gossip become the narrative that unravels you," he said, in a voice that wanted to sound grander than it could. "We will write poems about small cruelties and how they become history. We must be strong." Ethel listened and accepted a cup of tea as if accepting the words themselves might make them less heavy. The truth was that strength had different forms. Her kind of strength had been to walk with a straight back when everyone tilted their heads toward her, and answer with a sentence that cut through falsehood without bloodshed. Another kind of strength would be to orchestrate a refusal that changed other people's assumptions. That required a weapon beyond mere pride. The next week took the shape of legal maneuvers, public statements, and family calculations. The Tyler family offered her money to agree to a quiet separation. The offer smelled of a transaction that would erase her line by line. It was a small fortune, presented as a favor. The subtext was as clear as a knife. Ethel refused.
"Think of your future," said Vanessa, whose practical heart would have sold its own children for social stability if the ledger called for it. "This is not worth your career, love." Ethel thought, instead, of all the little careers she had already had to sacrifice. A quiet night alone with a book, a chance at the letters she wanted to write, a public reputation that would allow her to say something her father might actually publish. She had not married for social ascent. She had married for shelter and art, and sometimes the simplest of conveniences. To accept an erasure would be to hand the narrative to people who would manufacture a lesson about morality from her life. That she would not do. Fielding's interferences continued to rattle the edges. He had influence at a media firm that had the power to take down the clip, or at least bury it under more compelling news. He had contacts at the hotel where the footage had been taken. Someone within the hotel's security had begun to whisper about missing minutes in the tape. He could make a lot of things happen. He could also make life complicated in the way that wealth complicates the poor, by privileging action over privacy. When someone attempted to humiliate her on the steps of a charity luncheon, a man hired by a rival family to make spectacle thrust a microphone under her nose and asked inflammatory questions. Questions about morality, about propriety, about the supposed impropriety of a married woman in a stranger's hotel room. Fielding moved. He did not move like a man pushed by emotion. He moved like someone taking a chess piece. He stepped between the microphone and her, his coat cutting the bright exposure in half. "You will end this now," he said to the man, with a voice that implied consequences beyond mere conversation. The man stammered about a public's right to know, and then, under the pressure of Fielding's gaze and the menace of someone who could make a man's career stop cold, shut his mouth. Fielding's intervention was quick, precise, and it reframed the scene. He protected her from being made a spectacle, but he also made the spectacle focus on him. Ethel did not ask him to intervene. She also did not resent him for it. She had never been a woman who welcomed rescue as a form of owning. She had, however, learned to recognize when people offered help that would change the calculus. He did not speak to her like a man saving a damsel. He spoke like a man who had counted the cost and chosen to pay it. That, she decided, was an important distinction. There was a moment in the chaos when someone shouted for Ramley to answer for his wife's behavior. Ramley sidestepped, a man who had never learned to be embarrassed properly. Fielding looked at him with an expression that translated to, "Are you going to be a man, or will you be the kind of accessory that folds in the face of accusation?" Ramley, who had known himself as a man who would never be tested, found himself inadequate to the moment. He chose avoidance. Ethel's anger at that avoidance was a cold, efficient thing. She did not need his protection. She resented his failure because it removed an option from her that might have been useful, pretending to be supported by him. There was little value in hollow support. When Fielding's private investigator produced a copy of the full hotel recording, clean footage that showed only a conversation, nothing shameful, nothing intimate, only two people talking and one offering an umbrella, evidence was not always persuasion, but it was a wedge. The hotel security manager swore that minutes had been edited out on distribution. The clip that the press had published was demonstrably incomplete. Lawyers mouthed words about potential libel. For a brief moment, the story teetered on a knife's edge. Madame Turnbull responded with the efficient cruelty of someone trained in defense of a dynasty. "We will not be associated with gossip," she declared, to a rumor that had already dug roots. She did not apologize to Ethel. She did not say the Turnbulls had been involved in rumor-mongering. Instead, she reasserted the family line as spotless and spoke of standards. Lilac, who had been quietly watching Fielding's actions like a woman calculating future losses, moved through the world with the slimmest of smiles. Fielding did not dramatize victory. He did not parade the evidence in a public square. He arranged quiet dismissals. He did something older, more effective. He shifted attention. He did not simply remove the clip. He produced a new frame, his own statement about responsibility and about the absence of scandal. It was a move that protected Ethel and repeated a lesson to anyone looking to make a spectacle that there were forces in the city whose displeasure was costlier than infamy. People responded. The press moved to cover another scandal. Gossip columns recalibrated. The Tyler lawyers began to murmur about withdrawing the separation demand and considering more measured strategies. For a few small hours, Ethel could breathe with less poison in her lungs. She felt, too, an odd thing, indebtedness that refused to sit comfortably in her chest. One night, after the hospital, after the clipped statements and the legal parlance, Fielding came to find her in a dim cafe that had the kind of privacy the city rarely afforded. The light was low. The rain made the window glass bloom with soft interference. He sat across from her and folded his hands as if he were offering her a treaty. "You shouldn't have to accept favors," she said, because the moment needed to be clarified. "And I don't want things I haven't earned. I will not be a curiosity for anyone, even someone as capable as you." He smiled, a brief thing that did not seek to charm. "I didn't offer it as charity again," he said. "I offered it as an answer to an irritation."
"And what does that answer look like?" Ethel asked. She could not fathom why a man like him would expend force on someone like her unless his motives contained a hunger she did not understand. He looked at her with a careful intensity. "I don't like injustice," he said. "I don't like people who manipulate reputations to their advantage. If protecting you forces other people to account, I'll take that cost." It was a modest sentence, because modesty was not in his nature. It was also a dangerous one. It implied an intimacy of judgment, an alignment that might be more than tactical. For a moment, Ethel considered how often she had been mistaken for a thing she was not, an easy woman, an ornament, a cautionary tale. This man, with all his distance and wealth, had made a choice to step into her life with an intention that had none of the airy romance of soap operas. It was procedural and precise, and somehow very personal. She stood up to leave then, because she did not like the weight of feeling indebted. "I won't be bought," she said. "If you stand with me, it's because you see something in me you respect." He watched her go without responding, his hands folded, his expression tight. Somewhere behind his eyes, something like care dwelt, but as yet it would not be named. For someone like Fielding, action was the language he used when feeling alone felt like a liability. He would use leverage, influence, cold clarity. He would act. The week moved into a strange rhythm. In public, Ethel was the woman who weathered rumor. Privately, she was the object of a quiet campaign that she did not solicit and yet found herself inside. The Tyler family pressed legal demands. The Turnbulls discussed charitable priorities and whether their standing had been compromised by association. Lilac studied photographs and made plans. The city, always hungry for drama, waited for the next rupture. An invitation arrived on embossed paper to old Sir Turnbull's banquet, a gathering that came once every few years where the city watched the patriarch accept toasts and blessings, and where alliances were sorted like cards. The invitation came with a footnote. It would be covered by the press. The elder Turnbull would host, and the family would have guests of consequence. Ethel read it in the quiet of a kitchen that now felt like a room for plotting, and decided with a steady hand she would attend. It was, in its own way, a test of sorts. If the city demanded to watch how she behaved, she would not let the city see her crouch.
She would not allow her name to be trotted out as a lesson. Fielding learned of her plan almost immediately. His message was a single line: "I'll be there." She stared at the words and felt the world tilt slightly. That he would appear at the same banquet as a man who kept his distance from public sentiment meant he was choosing to stand where the public watched. It was a deliberate step.
It was a promise of presence, one that came with consequences and unforeseeable shifts. A week before the banquet, the city began to whisper again, not about the hotel clip no longer, but about the possibility that the Turnbulls might make a statement. Speculation rolled like fog. Madame Turnbull's hand moved to arrange seats with a precision that had saved dynasties. Lilac practiced a smile that could be a blade. Ramley tried to find a posture that made him look noble, and failed. Ethel could hear the market of opinions turning under her feet. She could feel the charged air of expectation. She remained, as always, defiant, a woman in a dress with her shoulders squared, refusing to let the narrative that shamed her be the shape of her life. If the banquet became a stage for humiliation, she would refuse to perform. If a Turnbull man chose to make the evening into something else, then she would meet that choice on her terms. There are many ways to claim a person in public, the loud performative ways that brand and own, and the quieter, more inconvenient ones that protect with a cost. For Ethel, dignity was never a commodity. She had learned to trade in small freedoms. If Fielding planned to shift the narrative, she would not be a passive beneficiary. She would require a different kind of arrangement, terms that respected her as an equal, not a pawn. Madame Turnbull would have preferred silence. She wanted Ethel invisible, an absence that would smooth lines and make the evening unquestionable. Lilac wanted to see the woman who had lodged in gossip be removed from the pedigree of possibility. The patriarch, old Sir Turnbull, aged and precise, kept his counsel. He had the power to change the shape of that room by his mere nod. On the morning of the banquet, Ethel woke with the kind of clarity that sometimes follows nights of bruised thought. She had written a list of terms in the small notebook she carried, conditions that read more like a personal manifesto than a contract. She would not be publicly spoken for as an object. She would not accept erasure. If the evening required a demonstration of alignment, she would make that decision transparently. The world, always ready with a camera, did not disappoint. Reporters clustered and flashed. Dresses were measured in headlines. The household of Turnbull moved with the smoothness of rehearsed defense. Ethel stepped into the hall with the steadiness of someone who had decided to be visible on her own terms. The banquet settled into motion, speeches that praised continuity, toasts that circled the room in polished crescendos. Fielding sat at a place that belonged to him by right. He watched the room as if he mapped it in his head. He did not look at Ethel with the possessive hunger of men who lusted after headlines. He watched with the kind of attention that announced, "I see you."
Then, as if the night needed one more storm, a photographer pushed through the crowd and held a phone up, replaying the grainy clip. The room shut, air sucked out in a collective inhalation. A murmur spread like a physical thing. Ramley's face drained of color. Madame Turnbull's smile thinned. Lilac's jaw hardened into a perfect, dangerous line. Ethel felt something in her chest go tight, not the hot stab of panic, but the colder knowledge that this evening could break or make. She did not flinch. Everywhere cameras focused, people leaned in. Fielding's hand tightened on the stem of his glass. He looked at Ethel, then at the audience, and the choice he made after that glance was something no one in that room would forget. He rose like a verdict. Fielding stood, the room narrowing to the thin angle of his profile. The replay stuttered on a reporter's phone, light from the screen painting faces into puppet masks. Someone laughed, too loud, brittle, and the sound landed somewhere between cruel and bored. Fielding didn't wait for permission. He moved through the crowd with the same economy he'd used in hospitals and conference rooms. There was no flourish, only a trajectory that made people make space. Cameras turned. The air made itself thin. A hand fell on the microphone stand as if by habit. He uncapped a voice that had never needed to charm. "Enough," he said. The single word did what the law sometimes failed to do. It unmade momentum. The murmurs stalled. Someone cursed under their breath. The phone screen dimmed as someone in the front row lowered the device, embarrassed at the obviousness of the thing they'd been feeding. Fielding faced them all with the polite severity of a man who kept a ledger of sins. "We can play edited footage all night," he said. Then, more sharply, "or we can look at the facts." He'd learned to be surgical with words. People believed doctors sometimes because they sounded like they were diagnosing a disease. Fielding diagnosed rumor. He reached for his own phone. For a beat, Ethel thought he might show the room the full hotel footage. He had the resources to subpoena it, to display the raw tape and collapse narratives with 10 minutes of truth. Instead, he did something that set half the room on fire and the other half into stunned silence. He did not pull up footage. He pulled a small velvet box from his inside coat. The flashbulbs went insane. "You will forgive me," he said, turning to where Ethel stood like a statue in a room of moving things, "if I spare you the replay." Nobody expected that. They had prepared for denial, for smirks, for a controlled statement. They had not prepared for a man of his stature to turn a banquet into a declaration. He walked out from the dais and across the marble like he intended to close distance. Every footfall felt like a line being crossed. He stopped a respectful measure away from Ethel. He did not kneel.
He had never been a man to indulge ritual where he could shape outcome with less theater. But his posture, the barely noticeable softening at the mouth, read like a question. "I won't let a woman's life be redesigned by a splice," he said, quieter now, his voice traveling despite that softness. "And I won't tolerate a city that thinks it can dictate a private life when it suits a gossip column." He opened the box. The ring inside caught light and refracted it into a dozen small verdicts. It was not an ostentatious thing. It was deliberate. No gaudiness, just a band with a stone that had been chosen in private, as if he had been working toward a point of consequence rather than spectacle. The room hummed. Madame Turnbull's fingers had tightened on a napkin. Lilac's face had drained to marble. Ramley's mouth opened and closed on a silent prayer. For the first time that evening, the patriarch, old Sir Turnbull, blinked, and the motion looked like a man reconsidering an old account. Ethel felt the world sharpen into a single line of possibility. She had walked into the banquet prepared to be watched and judged. She had not prepared for this, nor could she have, because this was not simply publicity. This was a claim. Fielding's voice was direct. "Ethel Collier, Mrs. Tyler, will you accept my name publicly? Will you accept being my wife, not as rumor, not as concealment, but as my chosen partner?" Silence pressed against them like a hand. Cameras thudded. The journalists in the room forgot the camera because they were part of the story now. Ethel felt the pulse in her neck like a small drum. Her instincts, those carefully honed ways she'd used to survive social maelstroms, kicked in. She could hear the speeches her father had tried to teach her, the legal letters she had refused to sign away, the terms written in a small notebook that she had carried in her bag. She had said on a park bench earlier she would not be hidden, she would not be bought. This moment demanded an answer that would not be performative compliance. She took a breath so small it might have been a private rebellion, and then stepped forward until she stood within the reach of the ring and the hush. She met Fielding's eyes. There was a rare thing in his look.
and exposed ragged patients waiting to be tested. "If this is a public bandage," she said, loud enough for the front row to hear, "then no." People leaned forward as if the next line might be a confession. Fielding's jaw didn't twitch. The room recalibrated like a machine snapping to a new input. She did not shrink from the audience. She addressed them as though the whole banquet were a court, and she insisted on a term. "If you intend to make me your wife in public, then I will decide the terms publicly. I will not be erased. I will keep my name. I will keep my work. We will make our standing transparent. No secret settlements, no little clauses that make me disappear."
"I will be your partner, not your solution." It was a demand of dignity more than of paperwork. It read like a modest revolution. For a woman's life who could be described as footnotes in social ledgers, the terms were radical. Fielding's eyes flicked to her notebook in her hand, to the small list she must have written earlier. He folded a fraction of a smile that suggested admiration rather than surprise. Then he nodded, a short, exact motion. "Those conditions are reasonable," he said. "I didn't come here to purchase you. I came because I won't tolerate falsehood used as weaponry. I came because there are lines I choose to cross. If your terms are transparency, equal name, and no secrecy, then I accept them." His acceptance was not an abdication of power. It was the enactment of power on her behalf. He slid the ring onto his finger and extended it. Cameras burned. The banquet blurred into spectacle, but the moment between Ethel and Fielding remained intimate, because intimacy, in their faulty, complicated world, was an act of consent witnessed. Ethel placed her hand inside his, and the ring found its finger with an economy that sidestepped theatrics. She did not make a show of dropping to her knees. She did not need to. Her acceptance was a decision made visible. "Yes," she said, "but under my terms." There was a sound in the room like breath unlatched. Applause rippled from a corner where some guests were relieved at the closure, humiliation averted. In other pockets there were gasps and the silver-laced mutters of people who had been betting on narratives. Lilac's face split in something at once wounded and furious. She wore her composure poorly. Madame Turnbull's mouth had become a line. Old Sir Turnbull looked as if someone had moved a piece in the chess game he'd been watching for decades and found the board rearranged. "Fielding," Madame Turnbull's voice cut like wire wrapped in silk. This is what?" he asked. The question was precise and very public. A man reclaiming the shape of a scandal, or a man refusing to let smear determine a woman's life? I chose the latter. The room flinched at the bluntness. No one liked being painted into a corner, not even people who made careers of contouring public opinion. There was no immediate rebuttal. Smears thrived because people gave them oxygen. Fielding had turned the floodlight elsewhere. Ramley had retreated, folding into the tiniest cluster of family who thought holding distance might preserve dignity. The humiliation was plain on him like a bruise. It was an image that would be recirculated for weeks, the husband caught looking irrelevant as his supposed wife chose another man in front of the city's cameras. Old Sir Turnbull, who had watched alliances form and fray for 80 years, cleared his throat. "Decisions that cause a stir," he said, voice honeyed with age, "require time to understand."
But, and here he looked at Fielding with that sharp old appetite for consequence, they also require respect for intention. It mattered in the slow calculus of dynasties that the patriarch had given something like a nod. Old men with long memories carried sway in rooms like these. His recognition was not wholesale approval. It was a crack, a space through which things might change.
Outside the hall, cameras already whispered into the night. Reporters fashioned the scene into a dozen new angles. By the time the banquet service ended, the city had its headline: Turnbull proposes to Mrs. Tyler in public, scandal redirected. The headlines were clumsier than the moment and missed the nuance of the terms Ethel had insisted on, but they did what headlines did best. They captured attention and forwarded conversation. Fielding escorted Ethel to a small alcove away from the press of forks and the hum of corded conversations. It was a private space that existed because rooms like this still held corners someone had forgotten to staff. For a moment, they were only two people. There were no microphones, only the lingering perfume of the hall and the faint memory of champagne. Ethel sat. Her hands were steady now. Part of her felt triumphant. Part of her felt exposed in a way that wasn't comfortable. She had taken the stage and set conditions. She had also chosen a man whose influence would be both a shield and a chain if she let it. "I don't want to be aided because you pity me," she said. It wasn't a rebuke. It was a boundary. "You won't be," he said, plainly. "I am not doing this out of sentimentality. I am doing this because it is absurd that rumor should be a weapon used to reduce someone. And also because I'm tired of watching people I care about be miscast." His phrasing, care without an invitation to become a project, was new to her. He avoided hero language. He offered a steady willingness to be present. That, for someone like Ethel, felt like the only honest kind of rescue. "Then there are practicalities," she said. "No secret settlements, full transparency as we agreed. I will keep my name. I will continue to use it professionally. I will not be a kept woman in the way your mother imagines her. If we are in public together, there will be mutual decisions about statements, philanthropy, and truth. I will not sign away my independence." He listened like a man synced to the beat of rationality. "You will not be asked to be less than you are," he promised. "We will make statements together. We will be visible, fully. I will involve you in decisions, not dictate them. And," his voice dropped a fraction, "I will protect you from manipulative men who think reputation is theirs to sell." There was tenderness in the last line, protective perhaps, but not smothering. Whatever his feelings, he did not reduce her to a passive ledger. He engaged her terms like a contract, because contracts were his language. Ethel liked that. It turned sentiment into something practical and less vulnerable to melodrama. "Good," she said. "Then tell your mother now. Tell her in a way that leaves no room for secrecy." Fielding's mouth thinned, like someone revealing an old decision. "Madame Turnbull will be told," he said, "and the family will be given a framework for how we handle the press. There will be statements. And you should know, we will investigate the origin of that clip and hold responsible those who weaponized it." Ethel inhaled. "Police?" she asked. She wanted to know whether the city would be obliged to do more than whisper apologies after the fact. "Already engaged," he said. "My counsel has the hotel footage and is coordinating with the authorities. If someone's edited material, there will be consequences." He did not speak triumphantly. He spoke like a man accustomed to shifting paperwork and effecting outcomes. "Good," she said, "because if we walk away with nothing more than a headline, then everything repeats. Women keep paying costs to stories that profit on their humiliation." Fielding nodded. He understood the language of social cost in a way most men of his world did not. Maybe because his life had been mapped by other people's expectations, he had learned where to step to tilt the ground. They left the banquet together with an economy of steps that made the cameras hungry. Outside, the city was a river of flashes and the muffled roar of people catching up on their phones. Reporters had already drafted tweets. By midnight, the ring had been rendered into GIFs and hot takes. The next morning, the legal machinery began to work. Fielding's counsel liaised with detectives. The hotel's security's original master tape, unfortunately, had gaps. A motion was filed demanding the raw server logs and chain of custody records. Forensic analysts cross-referenced metadata. It was, in the age of celebrity, a hydra of bureaucracy,
subpoenas, NDAs, contractual disputes. Within 48 hours, a story broke within the city's internal circles, a disrupted edit, fingers that matched up to a PR contractor with ties to a Tyler-associated firm. The narrative unfurled as investigators found anomalies in the export logs. That discovery shifted the angle from gossip to possible intentional defamation. Ramley's lawyers, who had been eager to bargain for separation, withdrew an arrogantly worded demand and replaced it with silence. Vanessa's calls became urgent and then less frequent. The Tyler cousins met in a smoky room and rewrote strategies. There were whispers that someone in the Tyler camp had paid for spin, a thin euphemism that, when translated for the public, sounded terrible. By the time the press caught wind, Fielding's name was in articles not only as the man who had proposed, but as an active force behind an inquiry into manufactured scandal.
That protective narrative, skillfully staged with statements from Ethel that spelled out her terms, reframed the story. She was not a victim without agency. She had accepted a public liaison on her own terms, and the city was about to discover that smear had costs beyond headlines. Lilac's response was theatrical. She called Fielding directly and demanded explanations drenched in the cold imperial language with which she'd always constructed her life. "What was that stunt?" she asked. "Do you understand what you have done to the family?" "What I've done," Fielding replied, with the patience wrought of old fights, "is choose not to let falsehood ruin a person." His voice had a flatness that made her insistence sound trivial. She attempted to manipulate pity and threat by invoking alliance and expectation. He refused all of it. "You will have your station," he said finally, "but you will not be permitted to use another woman's reputation to cement yours." She hung up incandescent with fury. Her social circle, who had been rehearsing victory, now scrambled into recalibration. Madame Turnbull issued the precise, archaic sentences of the concerned matriarch, but there was nothing overt in it, just a diplomatically worded expression of dismay. A calculated phrase designed to preserve lines of power while refusing public humiliation. Old Sir Turnbull called Fielding to his private study. The room smelled of tobacco and old wood. For a man who'd survived more political storms than most institutions, his question was not about the spectacle, it was about consequence. "You've chosen to upset the order," he said, eyes sharp under lids that had seen the city change. "Not because it suits you, but because you think it right." Fielding, who had rarely looked the patriarch in a way that sought approval, listened and then answered with an economy the old man respected. "Some things are worth the cost." Old Sir Turnbull considered the answer like an investment. "Very well," he said. "If you will accept the weight of what you did, then you should know I will not undo your support, but there will be expectations of conduct. This family is a line. Make your choices with care." It was almost a blessing. Older men granted grudging consent because they knew the world required people to make hard things visible. Fielding left the study with a small, rare smile. It wasn't the benediction he wanted from all quarters, but it was a map for maneuver. In public, Ethel issued a statement with Fielding beside her. Two people standing under the same microphone, their declarations coordinated and short. She made sure her voice was heard. She repeated the terms she had set at the banquet: transparency, mutuality, refusal to be erased. She thanked no one for saving her. She thanked others for opening inquiries and for restraint. The phrasing mattered. It was an act of authority. The cameras that had once sought to make her a commodity now had to record a woman making demands. As the legal inquiry deepened, some unpleasant facts came to light. A PR contractor,
fictionally named in press as someone separate from direct family members, had accepted funds to arrange narrative in a way that included editing and disseminating an incomplete clip. The contractor claimed plausible deniability. The trail, however, had payments and a chain that led through various intermediaries to a firm the Tyler camp had used in the past. The press did not publish the full accounting in the early days, but the seed of it took root. A few weeks later, a small hearing revealed both the contractor's culpability and the fact that someone within the Tyler orbit had signed off on the contract. The legal world moved slowly, but accountability arrived, not as an explosive public arrest, but as a reckoning of reputations. The contractor's business faltered. The Tyler family's internal suspension of a PR representative, someone they could not realistically defend, was announced as a restructuring that had moral overtones. The public found the term satisfying enough to call it a consequence. Ramley's social position collapsed like a poorly constructed house. He found himself the object of scorn more than sympathy. Men with fewer scruples began to whisper that his marriage had been a convenience, his role an accessory. He could not hide the way social capital evaporated. People who had once greeted him with polished smiles now watched him as if they'd discovered a misprint. The law did not move against him criminally. There was nothing in his record that made him liable for the contractor's decisions, but socially he was diminished in a city that measured men by the way they stood for the people they were supposed to keep. Ethel watched some of the fallout with a complicated satisfaction. She did not celebrate the humiliation of a man who had been a passive face in a marriage made by convenience. She was more interested in the larger logic, that those who use rumor as currency would find the market less profitable. She had been careful to avoid triumph in another's ruin. Her satisfaction was in the restoration of her own agency. Fielding visited her with a regularity that surprised her. He did so without pageantry. He showed up with small practical things, a new lawyer who rewrote the language of a statement, a trustee who arranged for an investigation into the hotel's internal logs, a quiet friend who sat with her over coffee and listened to the poems she wrote into the margins of her notebooks. His tenderness was not theatrical, it was precise acts that pledged safety without replacing her autonomy. When Ethel teased him once about the lack of romance in his actions, "Your love language is subpoenas," she said. He only smiled and produced a small list of steps he'd taken to correct damaged sources. "Practicality is a love language," he said.
They argued, too. There are no tidy beginnings in a relationship that starts in public controversy. When Ethel insisted on transparency, that meant Fielding had to change how he'd handled his own family's messaging. Madame Turnbull balked. There were long, difficult conversations that exposed the underlying architecture of power. Fielding's mother, who had always viewed the world as a series of negotiations, tried to persuade him to accept deals that would keep everything as it had been, an arrangement where reputations were curated in private and appearances were arranged as necessary. Fielding refused often enough that his refusal became a pattern. Those refusals cost him some alliances. Lilac withdrew into a shell of calculated grief and then theater. She staged a private announcement of her withdrawal from public intimacy with Fielding, an audible, cold statement that functioned like a social scab. The Turnbull salon quivered. Relationships shifted like tectonic plates. Yet there were small, unexpected gains. Old Sir Turnbull hosted a quiet supper for the couple, where he spoke softly about legacy. He told them, in a voice that had learned the currency of dignity, that the family could either be a house that closed its doors out of fear, or a house that stood for something beyond lineage. It was not a clear endorsement of Ethel, but it was a sign that a man with decades behind him perceived the difference between spectacle and decency. Ethel's terms did not mean a life without friction. The press remained hungry for detail. Columnists parsed their statements, picking at grammar and tone. Gossip programs speculated about private conversations. There were ugly nights when a tabloid columnist penned op-eds about marriages of convenience, as if the pain of people could be reduced to clever paragraphs. Those nights stung, but they no longer defined her.
There were also tender, private moments that would not make the society pages. Fielding and Ethel sat in his study once, late, where the city turned a low, muffled golden. They talked about what it meant to be publicly linked and privately vulnerable. He admitted he feared losing the very distance that made him safe. She admitted she feared becoming dependent on a man whose life moved on a different axis. "We're not perfect for each other," she said. "We are inconveniently good allies." "And we will be inconveniently honest," he replied. "We won't be a press release in love's clothing." They laughed softly. The laughter wasn't romantic in the old-fashioned sense. It was a partnership forming in the margins of two people who had chosen, deliberately and with eyes open, to enter a relationship that would be visible, negotiated, and, by their terms, equitable. The months that followed were practical.
They drafted a public statement concerning philanthropic endeavors they would pursue together, education initiatives, and a foundation that would support privacy laws and media integrity, oddly fitting for two people who had been hurt by public misrepresentation. Their philanthropy became part of the narrative, not the whole of it. It gave the press something to cover that wasn't merely scandal. It also allowed Ethel to shape an already public platform into something with purpose. Madame Turnbull recalibrated slowly. Pride is a long habit to unlearn. She softened in public enough to host a luncheon that featured both Ethel and Lilac in the same room without visible conflict. There were thin smiles around china cups and the safe language of polite conversation. The Turnbull household, which had once imagined Ethel an inconvenient variable, learned to do business with a woman who would not be eradicated. Ramley retreated into a small social orbit, where he attempted to rehabilitate himself with apologies and small, contrite gestures that looked wooden in the light. People were merciful with him in parlor rooms where the stakes were low and the stakes of gossip were a dull glow. He did not find sympathy in the public square. For Ethel, the sensation of him being reduced to irrelevance was neither gratifying nor sorrowful. It was simply another reality settling. One spring afternoon, months after the banquet, they attended a smaller gathering at old Sir Turnbull's estate, a garden event where the magnolia trees still took pride like slow, white sentinels. The mood was less charged. Children ran in the distance. The press had moved on to fresher narratives. In that measured sunlight, Ethel and Fielding walked along a path lined with hedges and small statues that seemed designed to be admired. They moved with the tacit ease of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Ethel's hand brushed his at one point and stayed. It was not a possession so much as a mutual resting, something modest and true. He squeezed her fingers lightly. "You were very brave," he said quietly, not in a tone meant to flatter, but to acknowledge a truth he found rare. "I had to be," she said. "I have a life to live." He nodded. "And yet, you didn't have to do it alone." She looked at him then, in a way that had nothing to do with the public and everything to do with a fragile, newly forming private. "I didn't ask you to claim me," she reminded him, "but I'm grateful you chose to." He allowed himself a straight, small laugh. "I preferred to choose." There would be more frictions and more negotiations. There would be nights when the press misquoted them, and mornings when family meetings turned into tests of patience. There would be legal matters to finalize, settlements to reject, and the slow, deliberate work of trust building that wasn't solved by a single public gesture. But there was also a new architecture. Ethel kept her name and her work.
Ethel published a collection of essays on privacy and public life that caught a modest readership and, more importantly, reclaimed the terms of her narrative. Fielding, often reserved, spoke at a panel about responsibility in media relations.
Together, they launched an initiative that, while criticized by some as image polish, did achieve small practical protections for subjects of invasive reporting. They did not quite achieve universal acceptance. Some corners of society remained skeptical. There were those who called their union strategic, those who thought it a stunt. They accepted that as the rough cost of being visible on their terms. In quieter moments, away from the social ledger, they learned to find normality. They cooked meals with ridiculous mistakes in seasoning and discovered mutualities in the mundane. Fielding revealed he liked small things, the taste of a decent coffee, the silence of early mornings that hadn't been planned. Ethel discovered that a man who commanded rooms could be terrified of delivering a bad speech. They held each other's hands through the small, ridiculous things that make life steady. Old Sir Turnbull adored Ethel's bluntness in a way that surprised her. Madame Turnbull, never quite liberated from the art of calculation, found herself saying, in private, "She has a backbone." Even Lilac, who had initially cut sharp words, softened into a polite civility. The city, always eager for new material, made space for the story of a couple who had transformed scandal into a partnership. The scandal that had promised to erase Ethel had instead taught a public a lesson about distance and the ethics of circulation. The contractor who'd edited the footage faced the slow, inevitable consequence of contracts and client distrust. The Tyler family, bruised and rearranged, learned that reputation couldn't be traded without consequences. Ramley continued to perform in small, apologetic ripples of social rehabilitation. Ethel did not end the story triumphant in some fairy tale hush. She continued to write, to negotiate, to set boundaries. The proposal in public had been a sharp tool, decisive, necessary, and fraught. It had rewired more than a relationship. It had reframed a narrative. At night, sometimes, standing at a window in the Turnbull house where the city lights made glitter into a kind of distant applause, she would think of the hotel where the clip had been recorded, of how a kindness once had become ammunition. She would think of the days when being visible had meant being vulnerable to strangers' invention. Then she would turn, and Fielding would be there, steady and present in ways that had nothing to do with cameras. She had chosen him with conditions. He agreed. The bargain was imperfect and honest. That, perhaps, was the most reasonable end to an unreasonable beginning.
In the months that followed, when the tabloid cycle tried to reheat the old clip into something sharp, it found a foundation ready with documents, witnesses, and a woman who refused to be erased. The press learned, to their irritation, that stories could be blocked not by silence, but by counteraction. The city did not become fairer overnight. It never does. But the moment at the banquet, the public proposal that had been as much armor as affection, remained a fulcrum. It shifted what could be done in her name. And in the quiet afterward, Ethel thought back to that rainy cafe where he'd first offered help. She remembered the sentence he'd written, "I am not offering charity, I am offering consequence." She had suspected consequences would arrive, but she had not expected they would come wrapped as a choice that she could accept or refuse. She had accepted. Not because she needed to be saved, but because she had been asked to stand in a new alignment, one where both of them would be visible, accountable, and, by agreement, equal. If you were watching what had begun as a one-night rumor and wondered how a cold billionaire came to propose in public, the truth was practical and quite human. A man who disliked injustice and a woman who disliked erasure found a way to make the public see them as they wanted to be seen, on their terms. It wasn't tidy, it wasn't perfect, but it reconfigured the city around an idea that sometimes dignity could be defended by deliberate, inconvenient choices. If this moved you or left you with a question, would you accept such terms? Leave your thought in the comments. Share this story if someone you know needs a reminder that dignity can be demanded and sometimes, improbably, defended in the light of day.